Hello everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the podcast series Climate Voyage, where we talk about the link between biodiversity and climate change. I'm Rasara Nandasena, and this podcast is conducted aligning with British Council Youth Climate Ambassador Program. Our main collaborators are British Council Sri Lanka, uh, Global Youth Biodiversity Network Sri Lankan Chapter, and Earth Lanka. Today the episode is targeted on transformative biodiversity, governance, and climate change. I'm glad to welcome the guest speaker for today, Kevin Lunzalu. He's a co-founder of Kenyan Youth Biodiversity Network, and also he's a coastal science and policy fellow, environmental magazine columnist, and Sydney Bios wildlife scholar. So join me in welcoming Kevin.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's nice to have you as well. Let's begin our discussion. Kevin, you are a very passionate individual when it comes to transformative biodiversity governance. So, to initiate the discussion, can you explain what transformative biodiversity governance means and why it is important for addressing the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change? So basically, I'm asking what is transformative biodiversity governance and how we can use that to address biodiversity loss and climate crisis.
Thank you so much. Transformative biodiversity governance, in simple terms, simply means tools and mechanisms that help us to move away from the way that we have been managing our natural resources and biodiversity in general. What that means is that over the past decades, let's say 50 years, or the number of years since countries gained independence, the mechanisms that have been there of managing existing plants and animals have not effectively contributed to averting the loss of the same. So we have increasingly seen biodiversity at the global scale diminishing over the years. So transformative governance calls for a new mechanism, a new definition, a new framework that will take the world away from the current ways of doing things to new ways of approaching conservation. So we need to rethink the whole phenomena of how we arrive at conserving that which is useful to us. So that is what transformative biodiversity governance entails. And it could be a complex system. It's not as simple as it appears, because for the systems to be truly transformative, we need inclusive framework, we need integration, we need justice, we need just frameworks. We need to have the capacity to realize that, and we need to be adaptive, to acknowledge that the things that are happening now, for example, climate change, the rate at which it is happening now is not the same with like when it happened 50 years ago. So it means that the approach that we put in place to address biodiversity loss now should be adaptive and reflective of the realities of the things that happen today, and also anticipatory. So we have to anticipate what will happen, let's say 10 years from now, what will happen 50 years from now, and what will happen 100 years from now, so that the governance systems that we put in place reflect this or are in anticipation of these changes happening. We've been talking about land use changes. We've been talking about food systems, our consumption patterns. We've been talking about pollution, all the key drivers of biodiversity loss. How do we then anticipate this? And how do we create models that reflect how this will span out in the coming years, and then put in place tools that effectively address them. So that's what really transformative governance is all about. And the other thing that you asked about is, how do we then address the twin crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change? So first of all, we need to appreciate that climate change is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. It's actually among the top 5 global drivers of biodiversity loss. And that then gives us an opportunity, because it's a global crisis, it gives us an opportunity to co-create solutions, both from the biodiversity world and from the climate change world. So we need to bring this discussion together, because what we have been seeing before is there are so many discussions around solutions to climate change and then solutions to biodiversity loss, but then these discussions are happening in silos. Even the conference of the parties, the COPs, there's a separate climate COP and then a separate biodiversity COP. So we need to integrate these things together so that we talk from, the same direction, from the same angle, and tackle these things as integrated as they are. And also realize the role of the traditional knowledge in all this, like how do we put in local communities, indigenous people, traditional knowledge, learn from how they used to conserve biodiversity in their days, but at the same time, appreciate the role that modern science can contribute to conservation of biodiversity. We're talking about research. We are talking about new technologies, So, for example, when we're talking about plastic pollution, and pollution was one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss, by the way. So when you're talking about addressing pollutions, yes, traditional knowledge can inform us about maybe the alternatives that our local communities, indigenous communities use in place of plastics. But then emerging technologies and science can point us towards modern alternatives. For example, development of biodegradable plastics, or plastics that do not have so much additives in terms of chemicals. So the way we reintegrate our companies, integrate our actions today can be informed by both traditional knowledge and emerging knowledge.
So thank you on your feedback, Kevin. So next question from me is, in your opinion, what are the biggest challenges prevailing in the world, or maybe in your Kenyan context, to promote sustainable biodiversity governance and climate action, and how you can come up with a solution for these challenges?
Yes, so it appears as if transformative governance is a new term, but it is not, because human beings, and by extent, looking locally here in Kenya, we have been experiencing a call of nature to do things differently. Nature has been reminding us constantly that what we did 50 years ago will not work today. We have seen increased flooding. We have seen here in Kenya right now, over 4.5 million people are experiencing drought-induced starvation. We are seeing sea level rise, hurricanes, and all heat waves, and all these manifestations of climate change.
Yeah, the transformations were happening and we didn't realize them. That's the case with me.
Exactly. So what we need to do is, leaders of the day, and by the leaders of the day, I mean young people, because, for example, here in Africa, we are the majority. We need to champion this, and the evidence is all over. Now, coming back to your question on the challenge that transformative governance of biodiversity is facing, is that yes, we are seeing these things are happening, but then the actions that match the challenge are not happening at the scale that is needed. So we need, as young people, to wake up, to remind our leaders that these things are happening. This is the reality of the situation, and they need to stop doing things the same way they did decades ago. And now, one of the gaps that we are seeing is that these youth voices are not being reflected in the decision-making processes of the day in many governments across the world. And not just even many governments, even UN systems. It was only until, say, 2010, when the CBD, started realizing that, oh, maybe we need the voices of young people in the CBD discussions. And that is how the Global Youth Biodiversity Network was born. So we need to keep pushing for such spaces where young people who are not only feeling the heat of the day, but are also on the verge of being the generation that will carry the most of the burden of climate change, have meaningful roles in discussions that shape transformative governance of biodiversity. Another challenge that we are seeing today is data deficiency, especially in terms of research. So some areas on biodiversity laws remain data deficient, and that leaves the governance systems without much evidence to form their decisions. We are currently here in Kenya carrying out a project called Plastic Off Turtles. And one of the things we have noticed is that the extent of availability of data on the prevalence of plastics around nesting habitats of sea turtles and other marine life is still very low in most areas along the Kenyan coast. So what that means is that if you want a transformative biodiversity, you'll need data. It is take time because this data is readily available. So the challenge is that people and research institutions, academia, need to dig deep into the key drivers of biodiversity loss, provide sufficient evidence that will then inform, policies that will shape the future of biodiversity governance. The third challenge that transformative biodiversity governance is facing is the alienation, the marginalization of the people that should be at the center of biodiversity governance. And by this, I mean local communities, indigenous communities, youth and youth groups who should be leading, should be on the front lines of biodiversity governance. So formulating processes, formulating policies, formulating frameworks without meaningfully and fully engaging these people means that when it comes to implementation, such groups are usually left out because they don't even know that a certain policy exists or a certain framework exists. And so when it comes to implementations, they are not part of it. They don't know that this framework is there. And I will give a classic example. In 2011, the UNCBD adopted the Aichi targets. Aichi targets were touted as one of the transformative agenda of the day. And it was expected that upon their success, there will be, much improved biodiversity governance, biodiversity will thrive, and the globe will, the world will realize its ambition. But what happened is totally on the contrary. The Aichi targets were largely missed. Actually, very few of those targets, if any, were achieved to the completion. And one of the reasons why those targets were not achieved or were not very successful is that even though the quantitative aspect of them, like how much percent of trees you want to plant, things like those, even though the quantitative aspect was clear, the qualitative aspect of it was not that, strong. Like, how do we integrate local communities? How do we, build on traditional knowledge? How do we strengthen systems where people are part of this process? How do we penetrate deep into the grassroots, so that no one is left behind and everybody is part of the transformation. And now this, upon realization of these failures, the CBD then thought of like the post-2020, which is currently being called the Kunming-Montreal framework. Then they thought of how do we make a difference in the Kunming-Montreal framework that learns from the failures of the previous, Aichi targets. So since the post-2020 was to replace the Aichi targets, the constituents, the parties to the convention felt, let's push for more integration of qualitative aspect of this framework. Let's have more implementation that is inclusive, integrating all the values, transdisciplinary, and also let's have a framework that broadly recognizes the role of youth, women, indigenous communities, local communities into this. The last but not least challenge that we are seeing in terms of achieving transformative biodiversity governance is the lack of government goodwill. So this is to say that we have governments who know exactly the crisis that we are in, but they are not ready to act. When you look at let's say the budget allocations that go into the ministries of environment, when you look at the type of appointments, the political appointments that are happening across the globe of people who should be leading the governance of biodiversity at national and global scale, it clearly shows that the goodwill to sustainably manage existing biodiversity and restore degraded areas is not there. And if it is there, it is on the minimum. So we want to see more proactive actions coming from governments and world leaders in terms of allocating enough resources to govern the biodiversity of the day and restore degraded areas into, prime productivity. And also cut subsidies that, harmful subsidies that contribute to biodiversity loss. Currently, the fossil fuel sector is hugely subsidized. Billions of money go into subsidizing, all sorts of products from fossil fuels, but limited amount of funding goes into conservation of important biodiversity areas. So what that does is that we are actually funding climate change. We are giving the fossil fuel industry a lot of money to run their industries and continue to emit. And when that happens, and since climate change is a key driver of biodiversity loss, what happens is that the governments directly contribute to the process of losing what we really depend on, which is biodiversity, in the areas that we shouldn't be losing, while pretending that they are actually working on it. So it doesn't make much sense if you, for example, a government allocates 2 billion to the Ministry of Environment, but then spends 500 billion a month on fuel subsidy, fossil fuel subsidies. So it's counterproductive and it doesn't even add up. So we need much more goodwill in innovative sectors that will take us away from the current emission crisis. So let's see, for example, companies that are trying to produce alternatives to fossil fuels being given the subsidies in terms of, let's say, tax reliefs, you see, so that they are motivated, the environment is fair enough for them to thrive, so that countries can then move away from emissions. And countries like Kenya here which depend a lot on agriculture. We need to see a lot of, effort going on into, reducing agriculture-induced emissions in Kenya and transforming the agriculture sector as a whole across the globe.